My name's Tommy Jarvis and I am the Learning City lead in Bristol. So I've been in post for about 2.5 years and I have now been given the catchy title of Education, Partnerships and Programme Manager. And I'm employed by the local authority to oversee the Learning City Partnership. So some learning cities across the country specifically are driven by local authorities, some are driven by universities. Bristol very much so is driven by the local authority. So I guess why did Bristol become a learning city? So Bristol is a very rich city in terms of its contribution to the UK economy. Outside of London, we're the only net contributor to the UK economy, so we put in more than we take out, per se. We're a culturally strong city, so we've just been designated a UNESCO Creative City of Film, so only one of two in the UK, the other one being Bradford. So a very strong kind of background around culture and film and art. We were the UK's first European Green Capital in 2015, so we're a sustainable city, well, moving towards becoming a sustainable city. We have lots of agreements in place to become carbon neutral by, I think, 2038 is the date we're putting on it. So again, we're sustainable, we're a cycling city. I think again we're the first cycling, we're many cities of, but we're a cycling city. And we've got a very strong group of people from many different countries. So over 180 countries of birth that we're aware of and 91 languages spoken. So we're very ethnically diverse and that really enriches the work we do. Also brings some challenges as well. So with all those things, why did we have to become a learning city? Well, Bristol, like many other cities, is very much a tale of two cities. So often divided on the north-south, so south being predominantly poorer than the north. Life expectancy outcomes, if you live in these block of flats here and you're a male, you're likely to die 10 years earlier than if you live in this part of the affluent north of the city. For women it's about 8.5 years, so life expectancy rates are drastically different. If you live in the north and you look down at the hill where these people live, you're going to live 10 years longer, and that's quite something in a city the size of Bristol. Child poverty, again I talked about, we're a rich city, but 1 in 4 of our children live in poverty. And again, that's not acceptable, and poverty leads to poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes, poor life outcomes in general. Education outcomes, again, very poor across the city in some areas. So in certain parts, so for good level of development at the end of early years, we're below national average. For expected standard in reading, writing and maths at the end of primary, we're below national average. Progress 8, which is the measure around GCSEs and progress from Key Stage 3 into Key Stage 4, we're below national average. We're out of 152 local authorities in the country, we're 150th across all three, across primary, secondary and special for attendance. So we're the 3rd worst local authority for school attendance in the country, in England. So if you're not going to school, you're not learning, you're not getting those outcomes. And there's also a safeguarding issue there as well. If our children aren't in school, where are they? What are they doing? Employment, again, we're in terms of core cities, we're around the middle, around not in education, employment and training, but when we look at our not knowns, which are classed as NEETs, we're actually right near the bottom for that. So again, not enough of our young people are in employment. And if you look at those outcomes for children in care and for people with special educational needs and disabilities, we're near the bottom. Finally, transport. Again, if you live in the south of the city, you need to take 1 or 2 buses just to get into the city centre. If you live in the north of the city, jobs are pretty much on your doorstep. So there's an issue around transport there and connectivity for people who already have all those barriers in place to access education and employment. If you live in the south of the city and you want to do science, you need to get on 2 buses to get to an A-level centre that offers science because their school don't provide that service. And that, you know, those young people already have those barriers in place, and we're just adding more and more barriers to their outcomes. So again, if we're going to focus particularly on education, because we're learning and education, we're looking at, as a local authority, we're seeing our power decrease. So especially around schools, academisation, I mentioned there, and increasing fragmentation. So we've got lots of academy trusts, we've got lots of standalone mats, we've got some local maintained schools, we've got some free schools, we've got a large independent sector around education. It's just causing that fragmentation. Schools weren't talking to each other. It was causing more issues for our young people in the city, and outcomes were suffering because of that. We've got a new West of England Combined Authority, also known as WECA. Some people call it WACA by mistake, but it is WECA. Again, that adds another kind of element, because WECA now has responsibility for adult education. So again, how, as a city, do we liaise with the Combined Authority to make sure there's a joined up offer for our adult learners? Rising inequality, so I talked about that, the gap is increasing around disadvantage. And we continue to see that, as other cities are continuing to see. Again, diminished resources, so cuts to education budgets, to adult learning budgets are really starting to hit home now. And schools are really starting to struggle on just having teachers in place and having the support in place to educate our children. Increasing student numbers, so we've just gone through a primary place bulge. And that bulge is now moving up into secondary, and there's some real concerns that we may struggle to offer our young people one of their first three choices for their secondary education. And again, we go back to transport. If you're talking about not being able to go to a school that's walking distance, you need to get a bus, or you need to get two buses. How's that going to impact on our attendance? How's that going to impact on those outcomes for those young people? And the final one is the increased complex needs. So there's a real struggle in Bristol around special educational needs and disabilities. There's budget pressures, there's an increased demand on services. Too many of our young people with special educational needs and disabilities are not being educated in mainstream education. Our special schools are overfilled. Our Director of Education said if we built 3 or 4 new special schools right now, we still wouldn't have enough capacity to educate all those young people who need it. So this is the kind of picture that we kind of came into. So that's why we thought, if we set up a learning city, we can bring partners together to plan, to coordinate, and to focus our energies on where we need to make the biggest impact. So in 2015, the Learning City was created. So I think we had our first Learning City Partnership Board in March 2015, so it's just been running at just over 3 years now. And our mayor at the time was George Ferguson, and he brought people around the table across the city. I think there was around 24 partners at the time, to really start to look at what challenges are in the city and how we're going to address those challenges collectively. And again, the Learning City Board, unlike some other boards, so Community Safety Board or the Health and Wellbeing Board, or statutory boards, the Learning City Board isn't a statutory board. It has people are there because they want to make a difference to the city, and it's about bringing additionality. So you mentioned, we're all here doing our day jobs, and we are all doing our day jobs, providing special educational needs and disability education, providing school places. Some people would say that's a statutory requirement of the local authority, but we can't do it on our own. One organisation can't do that on their own, and that's what the Learning City is about. It's about, the universities are spending millions on widening participation, but how many young people with special educational needs and disabilities are taking up those places in higher education or in further education or going into employment? So there is a need for partners to come together and think about how they can bring their resource to bear on the city. So in 2015, Learning City was set up. At the time, we set up with 4 challenge groups, focusing on the 4 key areas that we wanted to make an impact on, and that was around education, around work skills, so whether you're in work or whether you're looking for work. One was around looking at everyone was included in learning, so that was around those young people or people who are more likely to be excluded, so children in care, children with caring responsibilities, children with special educational needs, adults with from a care background or being homeless or have drug or alcohol addictions, mental health problems. So those people, that focus was kind of set up in its own group, and then there was a very much lifelong learning element. So we started off with that challenge group model, and I'll talk about that in a bit. Then 2016 came along, and that's when we gained our UNESCO Learning City status. So that was right at the beginning of the year. Our mayor at the time, George Ferguson, designated the year of learning. So the previous year had been the green year. This year, 2016, was the year of learning. We set up a Love Learning campaign to try and promote a culture of enjoying learning and seeing the benefits of learning. And we set up a learning ambassador program and recruited a number of learning ambassadors from across the city within partner organisations and within the community. We also launched our kind of flagship program, which was a Bristol Works program, which was about bringing employers and educators together to improve experiences of work for young people across the city. And our newly elected mayor, Marvin Rees, who came in 2016, mid-2016, made it one of his pledges that he would improve opportunities for work experience for young people. So the Bristol Works started to deliver on that. And in the first phase, it matched with 4 schools using data to identify the worst outcomes for young people, and took pledges from businesses who would offer a bespoke work experience opportunity. So not the traditional work experience, you go in for a week, you photocopy, you make some tea, you go home, you've learned nothing. Instead, they would go and they would do 2 hours at one organisation. They would see a specific piece of work, or they might be brought in with a big organisation like EDF, who would get them working on a project once a week, 1 day a week for 3 months. And at the end of it, they would see some real benefit from that type of work experience. We're moving into phase 2 of that now, which is working with another 4 schools, including 1 special school. So that will be 8 of our 22 secondary schools across the city who are engaged in the works programme. And I talk about challenges later, and I'll mention funding. And again, that's one of our challenges for improving that access wider for the city. So in 2017, we were awarded the UNESCO Learning City Award, and we accepted that award in a conference that was greatly hosted in Cork. 2017 was not a particularly easy year for us as a city. We've had some huge changes. Lots of our senior leadership within the local authority has moved on. WECA was set up. We've had political changes, we've had senior leadership changes, we've had partner changes, we've had people leaving the partnership because they've got jobs elsewhere or companies have relocated, etc. So it was a rocky time for us. Even though we were accepting the award, it was a difficult time. But I must say 2018 has been a much better year. So our new partners are all fully engaged. We've started to really plan for this year, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And our newly elected mayor, I say newly, he's been in since 2016, our mayor is looking at planning long term for the city. So he doesn't want to just look for the next 4 years, and he calls it the chaos of strategy. So lots of strategies go up to 2020, 2022, and then they just end. He wants a city plan that goes up to 2050 with some real kind of benchmarks along the way. And he's spent quite a lot of time in New York talking to their mayor who've done something very similar. I remember New York came over and talked to us, and their city plan cost £10 million to put together, or $10 million, and we've got nowhere near that. So that will really help us as well. So Learning City, Bristol Learning City are an element of that. You also have the Health and Wellbeing Partnership talking about, so if you're saying that one of the outcomes for the city in 2050 is that every young person has a good start in life, what's Learning City's contribution to that? Is it that we have schools that every young person is leaving education but feeling proud about their achievement? What's Health and Wellbeing's element of that, and how does that all fit collectively? So that's our plan for 2050. So for us as a learning city, what would success look like? So we would say if every child in Bristol leaves each educational phase proud of their achievements and having participated in high quality education, that's a success. Not everyone's going to be an A student, but as long as they're proud and they value the learning they've received and they've received the best learning that we can offer them, that's fine by me. People in Bristol have the knowledge and support to make informed decisions about their career and employment opportunities. Again, you're not going to get everyone a job as a lawyer or as a doctor or as an accountant. But as long as people feel that they have the right information and resources to make that informed decision, if you're a young person who lives in the south of our city and your parents maybe work as builders and all your friends work as builders, you're only going to see one career opportunity. Building may be the career for them, but unless you give them the opportunity to have a look at all those other opportunities, you'll never know if they could have had a more rewarding career for them. People in Bristol value and continue to participate in learning throughout their lives. So in some parts of our city, education has failed our citizens, and that culture of learning isn't for me is reflected onto their children and in their communities. How can we change that? And if by 2050 or even by 2030 everyone in the city sees the benefit of learning and participates in it throughout their lives, again, that's a success. And finally, Bristol has a coherent and cohesive learning system. So I talked about fragmentation earlier in the education sector. The education system in Bristol is vast, like it probably is in Wolverhampton, and people don't know how to navigate it. People who are in the system don't know how to navigate it. So if you're coming from Somalia and your English is your second language, you don't speak it very well, how are you meant to understand the education system? How are you meant to understand access to the education system, transition from each phase? It becomes more difficult, and those young people start to drop behind. And if we can make a coherent system, so we're doing that in-house very much at the moment through our Excellence in Schools group work, which is, I think that you probably have a school standard board, which is similar. So we're bringing those education partners in schools together. Sorry. So we've had a few challenges along the way. If you've been to Bristol in the last 2 years, you've probably seen lots of this. We've got lots of roadworks happening. For us, I would say, and I mentioned it earlier, change. We've had a lot of change. So a new director for education, new people service director, new cabinet member for education and skills. We've had lots of change in the last year specifically, and that's been a real challenge for us to re-engage those partners. And lots of those new people have come from outside the city, and it's about selling them the benefits of the Learning City. Funding, so we're seeing more and more money cut. So when Learning City was set up, there was quite a lot of cash injection into Bristol Learning City, and that's dwindled. And whereas the resource used to be 5 or 6 people, it's now just myself. So we're trying to hold that all together, and we need to make a bid really for more money, whether that's externally or within the city already. Expectations, and I said that at the very beginning, the big cash injection, year of learning, people's expectations were like, wow, this is gonna, they're gonna do everything, and we weren't able to do everything. So I would say managing people's expectations about what you can achieve from an early stage is critical. The culture, so as I said earlier, some people don't feel learning is for them. How do we change that culture? That's a challenge. That's around communicating that message and keep trying to get that message across that learning does change lives. It's the best way out of poverty. So it's about changing that culture. I looked up golden nuggets and I was blasted with cereals of sugariness, but I thought I'd better not use those, so I found some golden nuggets. So my golden nuggets of learning, really, I would say for me, from my perspective of being in Learning City since mid-2015, was engage schools early. Schools are critical to developing a learning city, and I don't think we did enough in the early stages to engage primary schools. That's one of my real key actions now, is to re-engage primary schools. So we have over 100 primary schools in the city. We've got thousands of young people who go to those schools. We've got hundreds of teachers. We've got the parents. It's one of the best places to engage parents, as well as, secondary school is more difficult to engage parents because they don't even drop their kids at the school. Primary school, they're at the gate. How can you engage them at that point? So key is to engage schools. And I would say the other one is to concentrate on 3 or 4 things you're really going to do well. So for us, we're looking at inclusion this year. We're going to work on the SEND. We've had a peer review of our local offer. We're expecting an Ofsted area inspection soon. As a partnership, hopefully we can deliver those recommendations that come out of that. We're looking at around attendance. How can we improve attendance over the next year? For us, it's key. If you've not got the bum on seat, they're not going to learn. There is a difference between getting a bum on the seat and engaging them in their learning, but we'll get there once we've got their bum on the seat. The third thing is around that post-16 offer. So from primary school up until adult education, what's that offer look like for people? At the moment, it's a broken jigsaw. Lots of it's out there. If we can put all that together, people can then start to navigate that system. And the final one is we want to make Bristol a city of readers. Literacy is key in education. If you can't read, then you can't access education as well. If you don't have a high level of literacy, you can't do an A-level maths or an A-level science exam because the level of literacy needed for those is so high. So we're focusing on those 4 areas over the next year, and then we may focus on some of them the following year as well, seeing depending on how we go, but really just focus on a few things, start to deliver those, and then you can hopefully start to show the benefit of the Learning City. So I think I've kept to time. So if you want to know any more, if you just have a look at our website, a lot of our photos and stuff have had to come down because of GDPR. So yeah, try get there before the 25th. Okay, thank you very much.